As the project developed, then the steering group changed. I became the chairman, I think, in late 2014. And the membership today, and it's changed over time because various people left, and the membership today includes the chief officer for the Ministry of District Administration, Tourism and Travel, the project manager, the head of the major projects office, and then 4 members of the CIAA management team.
Thank you. You mentioned that the project steering group was already in place when you arrived at the authority. Can you state who appointed you to the project steering group?
The chief officer.
Chief officer.
He was the chairman at the time of the steering group.
The chief officer of the ministry was the chairman of the project steering group
At the time, yeah.
prior to your
Yes.
appointment.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, the board.
Curious, at the time that you were chairing the project steering group, were you also still a member of the board of directors and performing your role as chief executive officer of the ministry, of the authority?
Yes, I was.
Did you perceive at any time a conflict in the responsibilities and obligations of either the project steering group and, of course, your substantial position as CEO?
No, I did not.
What were the reporting lines as it relates to the project steering group? Who did you report to, and who did you receive instructions from?
I reported to the board and received instructions from the board.
And you were a member of the board?
Yes, a non-voting member of the board.
A non-voting member. The Owen Roberts Terminal Development Project received its guidance initially through the outline business case, which was prepared in 2014. The outline business case was approved by Cabinet on the 5th of August, 2014, and thereafter by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office under the Framework for Fiscal Responsibility, which we were compliant to on the 15th of August, 2014. Phase 1 for the Owen Roberts International Terminal did not begin until a year later, in September 2015, with Phase 2 commencing the following year on May 2016. The outline business case stated that the project would take 8 years to complete. However, it was decided that the project should and could be delivered in a much faster time scale of 3 years. When was this decision taken, and by whom?
That was done probably in late 2014. I can't remember the exact date, but it was around late 2014, early 2015. It was discussed at the steering committee, and then there was a discussion with the board on it. We then went to, I believe we did a presentation to Cabinet or caucus, and that was through all that process we decided to shorten the time frame.
The project steering group, as stipulated by the outline business case, were to receive monthly project updates from the lead consultant. And we understood that that wasn't necessarily always the case. In particular, we heard testimony that there were occasions when the project steering group would go months without an update from the lead consultant. In one case, 3 months, in another case, 5 months, and I think it was 10 months before the project steering group received its first update from the lead consultant. What were, in your opinion, as chairman of the project steering group, what were the reasons for these delays, particularly given that the project had started, had commenced, but the lead oversight body in the governance framework, namely the project steering group, were not informed for up to 10 months of work that had already begun? What were some of the reasons why that occurred?
Well, I think the project steering group certainly were kept informed. The meetings were not consistent in that time frame for a couple of reasons. One was a large part of that time frame was the design stage. There was not much happening. The consultants were in the process of designing the project, and then later on in the 2015 to probably about Q4 2016, the phase one of the project was being built. Phase one was a very simple phase of the project. It was basically pouring concrete. So the steering group stayed in touch, and I think this is an area where probably they should have still continued to meet and record the way things were going, but the members of the steering group, if we recall, I said, were members of my management team. They were also part of a team of people that worked on a weekly basis with the contractors and the consultants on being able to continue airport operations while the construction was happening. And so they were very, very close to the project. Some discussions were had by email, and I accept that the meeting should have been held to record, when they were updated.
Thank you. The estimated cost of the Owen Roberts terminal redevelopment was estimated at $51 million in 2014. The final figure came in at just a little over $74 million in terms of the terminal itself. This increase in overall cost came as a result of a number of variations or changes to the scope of the contract. The project steering group were amongst the first to make amendments to the scope in August 2015, after the contract to design the project was awarded and the procurement of phase one was completed. The Airports Authority Board decided it wanted to make a number of changes to the scope of the project. 3 in particular included new parking facilities, landside canopies to provide protection for passengers against the weather, and bringing forward the planned implementation of new generators. Again, in phase 2, at the request of the Cayman Islands Airports Authority, a further 3 changes in scope were added that included upgrading to hurricane-grade windows, upgrading offices on the second floor, and replacing old sections of roof based on quality inspections. We heard from the chairman of the board that there were an astounding 412 variations to the contract made by the lead consultant, RS&H, and that there were a further 90 changes made by the contractors, 60 of which had to do with, I believe it was the design errors and omissions that were made by the consultants. So 500 plus variations made to this contract using only the 2014 outline business case as a guide. My question to the witness, Mr. Chairman, is why was a final business case not developed and published given the significant change in scope from the original design plans? I know it was discussed, but it never materialized. Why was that?
Yes, there was some discussion about the final business case. I think there was some confusion as to when it needed to be done, and that was primarily because the project came together in several different parts. There was phase 1, there was a baggage handling system, there was phase 2 to 5, and so they were all bid separately. And there was no one point until late in the program when we knew what the total bid contract amounts would be. I shouldn't say late in the project, but certainly quite a while after the start of phase 1. So there was that discussion going on at the time, but at the end of the day, it was an oversight. In terms of the final business case, I do believe that the final business case would not have been significantly different from the outline business case, which is a comprehensive document that covers most of the requirements of a business case. The only major change would have been that the costs in the final business case would have been the actual contracted costs, not estimates. And the risk allowance in the outline business case would have been captured and nailed down in the final business case.
We understand that the oversight of this project was managed by the project steering group, as I mentioned earlier on, and not the major project office that is outlined in the Public Authorities Law. And I believe the reason for that was that this development started before the Public Authorities Law took effect. However, that does not excuse the fact that the process for oversight could have, and some might argue should have, been amended to become compliant with the Public Authorities Law. Why was that not done, in your estimation?
Well, the major projects office was, from a contractual and construction perspective, they were the oversight. They fed back into the steering committee. There were 2 members of the major project office on the steering committee. So to say that the project was not overseen by the MPO, I think is not correct.
Is it your testimony that whilst yourself as CEO of the Airports Authority, the chief officer of the ministry, and other layman members of the project steering group were not they themselves engineers, contractors, experienced in airport redevelopment, that the project steering group was satisfied that the requisite expertise required to provide oversight for a 50 million plus project was sufficient in the membership that made up the project steering group, in your estimation?
Yes, we were. The membership from the major projects office brought the expertise from the construction side, and the membership from the Airports Authority. A key part of this project was keeping operations going while the construction was happening. So it was crucial that we had people who managed operations at the airport as part of the steering committee.
Given that this project occurred over a number of years, going back to as early as 2015, now 6 years after the fact, whenever the Public Accounts Committee or any other body is charged with the obligation of dissecting the decisions made after the fact, and certainly are reliant on witness testimony, but accepting the fact that 6 years is a long time, and I barely remember what I did yesterday, let alone 6 years ago. So asking questions to those persons who had oversight 6 years after the fact can be somewhat difficult, and I appreciate that. But an important part of the governance framework requirements, either as outlined under the Public Authorities Law or as accepted as general best practice, requires that proper minutes and meetings and documentation exists that would allow auditors or any committee to certainly dissect the decisions that were made and understand those decisions based on the written record. We were told that the project steering group had input to all of the decision-making as part of this project was concerned. But we also understood from the record and from the Auditor General's report that this decision-making did not occur in the setting of a properly constituted, regularly scheduled monthly meeting, but instead some of these decisions occurred in a sort of a round-robin format, whereas they were determined over email correspondence. So it wasn't a single meeting, but a question was asked on Monday, and by Thursday, after several back and forths, a decision was made regarding either a change order or variation or whatever challenges that the project steering group had to make. An example of this was the procurement process for the baggage handling system, which was, as we understood, determined by email. What was missing, though, according to the Auditor General's findings, was the absence of any kind of formal records that would enable this committee or the Auditor General's office to, as I stated earlier, be able to dissect the decisions made and understand the reasonings made 6 years in the past. Can you tell this committee, first, why the project steering group took the position to make decisions based on email correspondence and not a formal meeting? And secondly, why does there appear to be an absence of a formal record that can show how those decisions were arrived at?
So yes, I agree that there were those situations where communications or decisions were made by email or sometimes discussions on the phone. I think that later on, so this was at the very beginning when we had, I think, not as much guidance as we had later on in the project. So by late 2016, I'm pretty sure it was late 2016, things started to flow more smoothly. The committee met regularly, and we got it to where it should have been. But I agree that it didn't start out the way it should have.
Given that, as heard earlier, that there will be and should certainly be expected to be ongoing redevelopments of the existing Owen Roberts footprint. We've just completed the terminal redevelopment project. We are engaging in the airside redevelopment, which includes the extension of the runway, the inclusion of the taxiways, and we anticipate that we will see further ongoing expansion over time, as does occur in every major international airport in the world. But given the fact that you only came on as CEO in 2015, you were thrust into a major oversight role as chairman of the project steering group for a major project, having cost the public purse some $74 million to date. What lessons can you state to this committee you have learned? What things would you do differently, particularly given the fact that we have airside projects that are still ongoing? And would you agree that whilst it was not followed in the Owen Roberts International Terminal redevelopment, that a final outline business case should be the standard procedure when dealing with major capital works going forward?
Yes, I think a number of lessons learned. The last one you said is probably the most significant one, is to make sure we complete the process of a final business case. The need for a continuous record of decisions and actions that were taken, I think, is also a lesson learned. And you know, we went into this project, I think, with the mindset that this is the money we have. We got to squeeze everything into it. And in my view, going forward, it should start differently. It should start with what is it that we want? And if it ends up this, but we only have this, then we find a way to work either with that or around that. So I believe this is probably this project, just to go back a little bit, I think it was the first major project that eventually fell under the new law, the procurement law. The procurement law wasn't in place when it started. So I think I might be wrong, the Auditor General can correct me, but I think it may be a good case study for future projects as to how we can improve generally. But the final business case, the continuous records of decisions. I think also one of the lessons that the projects office has learned is that we have to have on our team the main cost consultant for the project, because that's something that has held us up on this project immensely, because they were not directly under our control. I'm sure there are a lot more that the project manager can speak to, but for me, those are the key points.
Just one final question. As the Chief Executive Officer of the Cayman Islands Airports Authority, and certainly responsible for the day-to-day operations of the airport, which include, obviously, dealing with the traffic of air passengers, be they tourists or domestic, anticipating the expansion and growth in this area, whether as a direct result of government efforts or a direct result of the success we have achieved in protecting our community from the COVID pandemic. And as I stated earlier on, I believe I say without fear of contradiction that the Cayman Islands represents one of the safest places on the planet as it relates to COVID-19, and that in and of itself has to be an attractive quality for visitors to the Cayman Islands. We see the virtual nomad system where persons are, coming here to work and whatnot. So there are many different avenues that certainly, once our borders open, as difficult as the economy is for many today, that will improve, and we can anticipate large volumes of air travel. Are you satisfied, regardless of the things that we could have done better, regardless of the lessons that have been learned in this redevelopment project and the ongoing redevelopment? As CEO, are you satisfied that the Owen Roberts Terminal redevelopment project achieved its overall objectives, and is that working for the airport and the people who use those facilities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we got great value for money for what was delivered. The success of Cayman has proven that we're probably going to have to do more earlier than we thought we would. Just as an example, from 2014 to 2018, the growth of passengers through Owen Roberts was about 45%. That's way above what was projected. The most likely growth rate was somewhere around 2 to 3% per annum. So we had a step change and that step change went on while we were doing this project, which also impacted, the delivery of the project. But I think now we have a we have a terminal in place that can handle that capacity. And, it's not just about the size of the terminal, because we can build it twice as big as it is now, and we might still have congestion if all the traffic comes in at 1 o'clock on Saturday. So it's about looking at ways to mitigate that outside of construction, things like slot management, which we're actively looking at now. Things like, working with the hotels to see how they can help us spread the traffic out. It's a discussion we've had before, and we need to pick it up again. And from a longer term view, we interact quite regularly with the Department of Tourism. In fact, the whole sort of trajectory of growth was done with their input in 2014, and we continually are in touch with them. But I think we need to make that more of a more organized, so that it happens when it should happen.
Bernie? Through you, Mr. Chair. Can you explain to the listening public why the decision was not made to help people getting off the planes still getting wet? Gateways, runways, whatever you want to call them.
Jetways from the aircraft straight into the terminal. That came down basically to cost. I've had this discussion several times with various people, and I don't think most people understand the total cost. One of the jetways, probably a second-hand one, would cost you anywhere between $500,000 and $700,000 just to buy it. But then there's a lot of infrastructure that has to be infrastructure that has to be put in place to support it. So the cost per jetway that we were advised by our consultants was anywhere from $2 million to $2.5 million per jetway to put the whole infrastructure in place, understanding that to put in 2 jetways is not going to solve that problem on a day when we have 8 or 10 aircraft on the ground.
Mr. Chairman, through you, because that same figure was thrown out, as you know, here in Parliament. And there's one thing about technologists day and age, you can always find out what our sister islands and other people, our sister Caribbean countries, what the cost is, and I can categorically say that you gave a better explanation than what was given in here, because you said the infrastructure to go around it, because I know the jetways, brand new, don't cost, and Category 5 rated for hurricanes weren't nothing up in some of those figures I'm hearing bandied about. But then you did say the structure to deal with it.
Yeah.
Because the public is constantly saying, how could you all build the airport and we're still getting wet coming off the planes? And with these overrun costs, I guess you could have found some money someplace to put them in, because the public isn't too pleased about that, but I guess they don't count. But through you, Mr. Chairman, the last one is there anything that you would have done different from what you all learned through this? What you all have learned that you think you'd do different?
Yeah, I guess that's a similar question to what were the lessons learned. So yeah, there's quite a few things we would have done differently, as I previously explained. But I think the core basis of how we went about dealing with the project was sound. It's just some of the things that we should have done that we didn't do, that we need to get right the next time. And I think, if I can just go into the airside project for a bit, some of the lessons that we learned off this project, we corrected on that project. And so far, that one is going quite well.
Mr. Anderson, the CEO who gave evidence earlier deferred many of her questions to the steering committee and the project manager. One of the things that comes out in the Auditor General's report is, and evidence given by the CEO this morning, is that the steering committee accepted plans that he described as which they thought was 100% complete, but he described it as only being 75% complete. What was the steering committee? Was it the steering committee who accepted the design plans for the project and started the project without knowing whether they were complete? What kind of review of the plans did the steering committee do?
The steering committee reviewed the plans from a functionality perspective, probably from an aesthetics perspective, to make sure that it would meet the functionally that it would meet the requirements that we were after. There was no one on the steering committee who could have looked at those plans and said, well, you know, for example, you got a sewer pipe and it stops right here, but it should be going over there. You know, there was no one that could look at that kind of detail and say that the plans were incomplete. So it's only now that we saw all of the changes that we had to make in order to make those plans to complete the construction that we realized that the plans were actually incomplete. These plans went through planning and building control. Fortunately, on the electrical side, they picked up quite a few issues early on in the project, which caused the first delay on phase 2. So they had to redo the electrical plans quite a number of times before the planning or the building control people passed the electrical. And that was clearly a very useful exercise. But in terms of some of the other things, you know, there were a number of, like I said, that would have gone through building control and planning as well, and none of those issues were picked up. There was a vast amount of documents with a vast amount of information on them. There's certainly no one on the steering committee that could have picked that up.
I will agree on the technical side, but something as simple as the baggage handling. You have the outgoing baggage handling was well covered in the drawings, obviously, but the incoming baggage was exposed to the weather. Yeah. I mean, that is something that any layman should be able to pick up, and why wasn't those kind of things picked up by the steering committee or your project manager?
I can tell you what, when I looked at it myself, there was a cover over the baggage handling system. It's just not deep enough. I didn't have enough expertise in my head to understand that it's not deep enough to keep the rain out. So, but yeah, I mean, someone could have picked that up beforehand and made sure it was right.
The CEO earlier suggested that there were some 412 changes to the actual drawings. Were they, and the example you just gave with the sewer pipe, was that picked up by the contractor or was that picked up by the project manager? And how would these changes come about?
I think it was a contractor, but I'm not 100% sure. But there were a number of changes that were identified by the contractor, and then had to go back to the design team to actually design what should have been there before. And then, of course, that would have been an increased cost because the contractor didn't bid for that. So,
did you supply a certified bill of quantities for the contractor to bid on, or was the contractor expected to do their own bill of quantities?
No, the bill of quantities was done by our consultant.
Okay. And that was certified as being accurate, and that's what the contractors bid on?
Yes.
Okay. So I just want to understand how the steering committee seems to be structured from the evidence that you and the CEO have given. The steering committee was made up by management of CIAA, board members, persons from the ministry, and persons from the major project office.
The only board member in the steering committee was me.
The CEO said this morning that Mr. Strand...
I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, the chief officer was also there.
The question I'm leading up to is where are the checks and balances? If everybody who should be checking what's going on is on the same committee, and nobody seems to be independently reviewing the things that are ongoing.
I suppose you could say that there should be someone independent. When the makeup of the committee, when I first came on board, and this was in the concept stage, when the master plan was being done, had more people from different areas of government, Department of Environment, I think MRCU was on it, and a few others, and that at that time. That's probably more what you were talking about, the kind of people that may have, that would probably reduce the chance of there being a conflict. But as the construction started, it just made sense that we have operational people on the committee, because we had to make decisions on the fly on a day-to-day basis. And the best people to do that were the people who were in there on the ground trying to get passengers through a building that's being constructed. So it made sense that we had operational people on the committee.
Was the steering committee the group that made the decision on price charges by the contractor related to the changes that you all approved? Or was there, again, an independent, knowing, or...
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Was it the steering committee that made the decision to accept the pricing by the contractor on these 400 and odd changes?
In some cases, yes. In some cases, it had to be done. I mean, it was like, you're on the ground, this has to happen, you just got to say, go ahead and do it, and then the price comes later. And in a lot of those cases, the price isn't finalized until you actually have the final account. So,
but did the steering committee require the contractor to use the same pricing formula that he had used to price the original contract, yes, whether that was a hourly charge, yes, or a project charge, or?
Yes, the same rates that he used to bid was what he had to use for any changes.
Okay. One of the things that seemed to have been the basis of all the problems, right, was the decision by the Tender Assessment Committee when they had a consortium of consultants who bid on this, but it seems from information that we have that the Tender Assessment Committee made a decision to select only RS&H to do the drawings and be the project consultant, i.e. for drawings and building, etc. What was the basis of that decision?
I think probably needs to be some clarity around that. There was a consortium who which bid under the name of Chalmers Gibbs. And that group of, I don't know if I'm allowed to call the names of the companies, but there was a group of companies.
The Public Accounts Committee, you can call them.
There was a group of companies including AMR, JEC, Chalmers Gibbs, the RS&H, and I think that's it. May have missed one. Anyway,
ARUP.
Sorry?
The ARUP group, I don't know who that is, but
right,
that's the information I have.
Okay. So they put in the winning bid under Chalmers Gibbs. The lead project manager at the time, and he was part of, and that speaks to the whole assessment committee, decided that of that group of people, the one with the most airport construction experience was RS&H, but it was done under the name of Chalmers Gibbs. So the request wasn't to change who won the bid, it was to change who would be the lead consultant on the project, because they were the ones with the expertise and the skill set that was demonstrated by the documentation they provided and research that was done, that they had done this before.
But in doing that, you eliminated all local knowledge.
No, we did not. They were still all part of the group. They were just being led by RS&H instead of Chalmers Gibbs. So
you still had and or that consortium was the consortium that produced plans that were only 75% complete with existing local knowledge and produce electrical drawings that had to go to the BCU 14 times, as the CEO said, before they could get it right?
It was that group.
Wow, okay. But was nobody in that group that had MEPF experience that they were selected?
Well,
Which is probably the reason why the sewer pipe was short of the connection.
the lead consultant had MEPF expertise on their team. That's all I can say.
Evidence given by the CEO this morning suggests that the board, on the recommendation of the steering committee, just kind of arbitrarily eliminated certain things in order to meet budget. Is that the process, or was there some kind of rationale used of, well, we can do without this now, to keep in the budget, as opposed to saying, well, all of these things that you had to add back, i.e. the 15-pound windows, which was in the original drawings, went down to 6 or 9 pounds, right, to reduce price, but in the middle of it, then you had to go back to the 15-pound.
Yeah.
Is there some explanation for those kind of decision-making, or?
Yeah, I mean, early on, if you just take the windows as an example, early on there was a discussion in the concept stage before drawings were actually finalized to say, yeah, we could go for this, but this is going to drive the cost up quite a bit. So if we do this, we'll meet the requirement. The place is not a hurricane shelter, so it'll be fine. And then as we found out that the money available to us, when the project was about to start, was more than we thought we would have before that. So that was when then the decision was taken to let's try and make, well, that particular one actually came later on after the construction had started. But it was because funds were available that we made the decision to put some of these things back in. So it wasn't, and it's, I think the architects call it value engineering. So when you adjust things to fit within a price envelope. But when we found out we had more funds available, then we said, well, then, maybe we should put it back to what we wanted to start with.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
If I may just ask one question along the same lines that you're, I think, focusing on now. We accept the witness testimony that the decision was taken by all and sundry, which included members from the Major Project Office, members from the Public Works Department, to swap out the lead consultant from Chalmers Gibbs to RS&H based on what was identified. I think the chairman of the board stated that RS&H dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's and looked good on paper. And we were also told that the lead consultant performed satisfactorily during the design and development stages of the project from January to October 2015. But it was later on discovered during phase 1, between October 2015 and September 2016, that there were a number of concerns regarding the performance of RS&H, who again at this stage were swapped out because they were considered to be the expert in this area. Concerns related to the time taken to respond to the contractor's request for information, and this is found on paragraph 35, page 14 of the Auditor General's report. Concerns over the submitting of approvals and pricing. Concerns over the agreement to the contract variations, which earlier on we stipulated exceeded 500 different variations over all the life of the contract, as well as submitting monthly status reports. A key aspect to the governance framework, which seeks to ensure value for money, is that key decision makers are kept informed of the project's risks and issues as they happen. We are informed through the Auditor General's office that the concerns, the early concerns raised or identified over the performance of RS&H never reached the project steering group. These were concerns raised by the airport's authority, but the airport's authority decided, for whatever reason, that it was not significant enough to raise those concerns with the project steering group, who had overall oversight. I'm curious, as you gave testimony earlier, that you served both as chairman of the project steering group, but you also fulfilled your role as a non-voting member to the Cayman Islands Airports Authority Board. Why is it that the concerns, the early concerns of performance of RS&H were raised and identified as a concern at the board level, but it was decided not to raise it as a red flag at the project steering group level?
I think that goes back to my previous comments that those discussions would have been had. I'm pretty sure that they were had with the steering group members, but not in a meeting setting necessarily. So, and it goes back to we need to have those meetings and record that we did these things. So that's, again, one lesson learned.
Do you believe if those concerns had been brought to the attention of the project steering group at that early stage, that action could have been taken to address the performance issues sooner versus waiting until the project was much further advanced, things like the baggage handling system, the incomplete design drawings, the challenges in receiving the approvals, all of which were the responsibility of RS&H. Do you believe, after the fact, that had those red flags been raised earlier, that we may have avoided some of the challenges, and in particular cost overruns that certainly raised their ugly head further on in the project development?
I believe that if RS&H had action was taken, just to clarify that, even though it may not have been recorded in a steering committee meeting, but action was taken with RS&H in terms of voicing our concerns and demanding an improvement. However, they would improve for a while and then fall back into the... So to the extent that the RS&H lead project manager on the job was fired, I think, sometime in early 2017. He was replaced with another guy who was not much better, and he was fired in late 2017. And then we got a third project manager who was much better, but had a lot of baggage to deal with from what happened previously. And so we had no issue with this particular project manager. He was very responsive, and he seemed to be doing all the right things, but there was too much that had already happened, and it just led us down a pretty bad path with RS&H. So I don't know that, as I said, the steering committee were aware of what was going on. I think the actions that we're taking would have been the same actions that would have been taken if we had recorded those discussions. I believe we tried everything we could with RSNH. However, I guess the main action that could have been taken would have been to release RSNH and take on a new set of consultants. But that would have had any number of problems, any number of additional costs. I'm sure the project, my limited construction knowledge, but and I've also had this discussion with the head of the MPO. It would have cost us a lot more to try and engage a new architect to take over work that someone else had started and ask them to complete it within the same budget.
So despite these concerns, can you state, did RSNH receive the contracted $4.096 million, which was their portion for services rendered, despite these performance concerns?
Yes, they were paid, and no one has said that they didn't deliver what they were contracted to deliver. They just didn't do it in the right time frame. So the main impact on this project was delays. We stopped paying RSNH sometime in 2018, early 2018, maybe around April, May. They continued to work until July, in fact, past July. But we told them that we were not paying them any more money and they had to finish what they committed to do.
But these delays, as you just gave testimony of, had a value.
Yes.
And these delays contributed to the cost overruns. And
Yes.
these delays, as we have heard witness testimony, came as a result of, despite looking good on paper, despite having more experience in airport redevelopment, whether they be plans or otherwise being incomplete, these delays and actions or lack thereof by RSNH cost the taxpayer more money, yes?
Yes. However, when you look at it let's take the missing, it did cause a delay, the missing sewer pipe, for example. If that had been there, we would have still had to pay for it at the beginning. So yes, it did cost more. How much that would be difficult to calculate. And all of that is a basis of this ongoing dispute that we have now with RSNH.
Just a final question. Are there any plans or are there any considerations for pursuing action against RSNH at this time or any future period?
That's a matter of discussion with our legal counsel. We have a meeting coming up with them soon to try and close out the final account, and it depends how all that goes.
Just a couple of follow-up questions. Did the major project officer ever advise the steering committee of the inherent risk in starting this project with incomplete drawings and?
No, I don't think that the incomplete drawings came to light until after the project had started.
Was one of the responsibilities that you all employed a major project office to do was to review the drawings?
I can't say specifically that was one of the requirements. It was basically the high level thing was to manage the project, whatever that entails.
Okay. Did the steering committee, we talked earlier about how the contractor submitted their claims for additional things that were not part of the original contract. Did the steering committee do its own assessment, or was the steering because I think you said earlier that JEC was still involved in the sign off of cost? or were those prices just sent to JEC with the expectation that they would review the cost in terms of the original contract?
So whenever there was a change, it was managed by both the contractor and JEC. So JEC, they would come up with a rough order of magnitude for the cost, because these things, in a lot of cases, you had to keep the job going, so you had to proceed with the work. So we get this rough order of magnitude, give the go-ahead, and then the final cost would be worked out later between the cost consultant, JEC, and the contractor.
Did that figure require approval by the steering committee?
No, not in all cases. And again, as I say, in a lot of cases, the work would have been done before you got the figure, because you just had to keep things going.
Right. But because my concern there is that having to do it the way you had to do it leaves a lot of room for overcharging. Was it ever discovered that Mike Alpine, the contractor, was in fact using the opportunity for delays and or changes to increase their prices in terms of what they were expected they would earn from the project?
No, I can't say that we ever suspected that. They were committed to providing whatever work they did at the same rates that they bid on, and it was the job of the cost consultant to make sure that that's what was happening. So, I think we never did suspect that was happening. What the problem we had was with the delays happening in the first place, and then a further delay in the cost consultants and whoever else from the RS&H agreeing the final price with the...
And the cost consultant that you're referring to would have been JEC?
Yeah, but we didn't hire JEC directly. They were hired through RS&H. So they were part of that consortium of...
Oh, okay. So you
So any communication about costs, consultation was done with RS&H. They were our contractor for that.
So you're confident, or that you don't have a reason to suspect that the contractor, because of the delays caused by somebody else, they did not get any additional billing. They just wore it out on their own and only relied on what it would have cost them to do it if it had not been in a delay?
I'm not going to put my head on the chopping block and say that. All I'm saying is that we don't suspect that they got paid any more than they should have.
Just one final question. Again, accepting that, like every other major airport in the world, where redevelopment is constant and ongoing. The airport terminal has been expanded, but as you've identified, we're, 45% capacity when we were expected to be at 10% capacity. So clearly the timelines are expedited. We've got runway expansions, taxiway expansions, ongoing considerations for footprint expansions, both horizontally and vertically. And because we accept that many lessons were learned as a result of this exercise, has there been or will there be a post-construction evaluation that the authority or the ministry has or will complete that will guide the ministry in future redevelopment projects? Can you say if it's been done or if there are plans for this post-construction evaluation to be done?
It has not been done. I think it would be a good process for us to go through, so I have no problem moving that forward.
Thank you. I think it would be of value not only to this committee, but as stated before, because the ongoing projects are just that. They will be ongoing. So thank you.
The CEO earlier suggested that in fact, he guaranteed that the final cost is going to be $74,030,000. But then, no, and 30,000, no? Huh? Or 300,000? Which one is it, Mr.?
It's 74 million and 74.03 million, whatever that is. 74 million and 30,000. I think that is
74 and 30,000. That's what I thought. But maybe I misunderstood what he was saying, right? He said there's a meeting in a couple of weeks to finalize the allocation of that $74 million. We just rounded off to 74 million. If you don't have agreement on the cost centers, how can you have a final figure?
So there's a figure that the contractor has put forward. We are pretty sure that the cost consultants are in agreement with that. What we need is the final document that says that and which lays out all the reasons why that's the right amount. And that's what has been missing for some time that we've been trying to get. And the meeting next week is all about getting that right.
But if you don't get it, if you don't get that agreement next week, it'll go off into the future further, because we're what, 2 years looking for a final figure, or getting close?
Yeah. I mean, it's been a struggle. Lots of communications and not much action on their part, for reasons that only they know. But our intention next week is to have this meeting and take a good record of all the reasons why they're saying they can't do it. And if that proves to be the best we can get, then we'll have to just close it out there.
But because again, my understanding would be that the final figure would be a totality of expenses that have already been agreed and paid for various entities, or is it the expectation that once you come to this final figure, there are additional payments to be made to make up to that figure?
No, once we come to that final figure, there's one more payment we have to make. This is just money we're holding that would take us to that figure, and then we're done.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. Appreciate you coming down and explaining this complicated process to us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, sir.
Yeah, the committee is suspended until 2 p.m.